Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, and welcome back to New Books in Political Science, a podcast channel on the New Books Network. I'm Lamisa Abdelalti from the Maxwell School of Syracuse University. Today, I'll be talking to Tanisha Fazal about her book, Military Medicine and the Hidden Costs of War, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2024. Nisha, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I wonder if we could begin the interview with you just telling us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. I'm a political science professor at the University of Minnesota. I'm a scholar of international relations. Most of my scholarship has been on international security in particular. My first book, which was called State Death, was on why some countries disappear from the map of the world. My second book, which is called Wars of Laws, on international humanitarian law. And this book is also obviously on international security issues.
So can you tell us the story of how you came to write this book?
Yes, I mean, it is a little bit of an unusual book for a political scientist to write, I'll admit. I, a number of years ago now, probably about 10 years ago, was working on my second book, which I just mentioned, on international humanitarian law. And I had a paper out of that project on why it is that we no longer see peace treaties in interstate war. And I got the reviews back because I submitted it to a journal for peer review. And one of the reviewers really wanted me to engage with what was at the time a pretty new literature arguing that war was in decline. And so Steven Pinker, the Harvard psychologist and public intellectual, has really been at the forefront of making this particular argument. And so I had Pinker's book on my shelf. I was going to read it one day. And then all of a sudden I had to read it. And so I pulled it down. I read all 650 so pages of it, cover to cover. And the first few chapters of Pinker's book, which is called The Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined in Our Time, something along those lines. The first few chapters are really about interpersonal violence. They're about how we treat our children, spanking, for example, how we treat our pets, homicide rates in London in the Middle Ages, etc. But then the back half of the book talks about or makes an argument that war is in decline. And so now we're kind of in my wheelhouse. And I'm reading these chapters arguing that war is in declining and realizing that the empirical basis for the claim that war is in decline is entirely based on fatalities. But Pinker, of course, is making an historical argument about a trend over time. And over the same time period, there are dramatic improvements in medicine, both civilian medicine and military medicine. So getting knifed in the stomach in 16th century London is not going to lead to the same outcome, even for a civilian, as getting knifed in the stomach in 21st century London. And certainly military medicine has advanced significantly. So I started doing some research on this. I wrote a rejoinder to Pinker that was published in the journal International Security, basically saying that war has become less fatal, but that doesn't mean that it's become less frequent. People are still trying to kill each other, but the outcome of those attempts is different over time because of these advances in medicine. And one of the things that really stuck with me after writing that piece was that there were these long-term implications of these improvements in military medicine. So you have more people surviving wars that they would not have survived in the past, and that's a good thing, but it leads to some longer-term costs of war that I felt that were really underappreciated in the literature and also in policy circles.
And that's a great segue to my next question, which is about your central argument here. So it's related to military medicine and veterans benefits, right? And their evolution over time. So can you walk us through your central argument?
Yes. The basic argument of the book is that dramatic improvements in military medicine alongside improvements or increases in the veterans benefit system in the US, especially since World War II, have increased the long-term downstream costs of war in ways that we tend not to appreciate. So to put some numbers to the military medicine piece of it and the improvements on that dimension, historically, the ratio of wounded to killed in battle was 3-1. So for every person who was killed in battle, you would get 3 people who were wounded. And this statistic is called the wounded to killed ratio, was almost like a rule. And in fact, there are people who effectively set their clock by it. There are data sets that are based on the statistic. They use it kind of as a backstop. If they don't have enough information, they'll use that rule to make some additional calculations. For the US today, and the book is focused on the US case, the wounded to killed ratio, depending on who you talk to, is somewhere between 10-1 and 17-1. So it's more than tripled over time. And so what this means is that as a percentage of those deployed, you have many more people coming home having survived injuries that they would not have survived in the past. And so they are bearing the costs of war on their person. Their families are bearing the costs of war. They have to take time off from work. There are also financial costs associated with taking care of a loved one as well. And on the government side, a lot of times when we think about costing out war ahead of time, before a war, when people talk about the human costs of war, they tend to think about them almost exclusively in terms of fatalities. I was actually just reading something, a paper yesterday talking about casualties, and I realized 3/4 of the way through that this author was really meaning fatalities, not casualties, because casualties includes non-fatal casualties, not just fatal casualties. But in the US, in our discourse, and certainly in the scholarship about foreign policy and the decisions to go to war, arguments about the relationship between public opinion and the decision to go to war. There's actually a really famous argument out there called the casualty aversion hypothesis, the notion that the more casualties US forces sustain, or really any country's forces sustain, the less there will be public support for war. All of that literature, or virtually all of that literature, really defines casualties exclusively in terms of fatalities. And that's a problem because we don't have the balance of casualties in the US today is actually quite different to what it was in the past. So that was one correction or one intervention I wanted to make. And then at the same time, another part of this increased cost of war has to do with changes in the US veterans benefit system, especially since World War II, where veterans benefits have been this rare bipartisan issue for a long time now. Politically, it's very savvy, or has been very savvy, to really support veterans benefits. They've been considered a kind of sacred cow in US politics. And so veterans benefits since World War II in particular have just increased over time. And so you have, again, as a percentage of those deployed, more people coming home surviving injuries than they would have in the past due to these improvements in military medicine, but they're also coming home and they have accessible to them this expanded veterans benefit system. And so this is what I mean by the long-term downstream costs of war that we tend not to think about, because precisely when we think about the human costs of war, we almost always think about it in terms of fatalities. And when we think about the financial costs of war, I think the default is to think of, well, how much does it take to get a fighter jet in the air, as opposed to these longer tails of the costs of war.
So you've mentioned that that the book focuses on the United States. More specifically, it also focuses on sort of 3 sets of wars, right? The Civil War, the World Wars, and then counterinsurgency wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Can you tell us why you choose to focus on the U.S.?
So I focus on the US for a few reasons. One is that it's a lot easier to tell this story if we're just talking about one case, because there's a lot of research that goes into any book, and this book is no exception. But also because the US is a really belligerent country. The US has been at war for most of the time that most Americans today have been alive. And the US, as we know, is a global hegemon. It's also, as a result of that, its practices in its military, including its military medicine, actually diffuse globally. There's a lot of training that the US does. So it's kind of the starting point for a lot of these advances in military medicine in particular.
Before we dive into your empirics, I wondered, can you tell us about what sort of research you did for the book, or what types of data you rely on?
Yes, so there's a range in this case. There's a lot of I definitely leaned a lot on military medical or historians of medicine who have really done a lot of the hard work, especially when it comes to the Civil War case. There's actually much less written in terms of history of medicine on the World War I case, partly because the US was not in World War I for very long. Although there's a very long or very large set of the official medical history of the US in World War I, this 17-volume set. And that's the second kind of source I used, were these primary sources, really some of them quite old, from the 19th century, certainly for the Civil War case. So these official medical histories, memoirs of doctors. I did a lot of archival research, and that was actually fascinating, and really, I love doing archival research in general, but for this book, what was really interesting and fun about it, well, there are a few things. One was that in looking at the papers of various military doctors, you start to see them conversing with each other, because it was just a club, right? They all knew each other, and they're saying, oh, let's give this person a job, let's give that person a job. And in fact, it's not this person, it's this guy. Let's give this guy a job or that guy a job. And it becomes also clear very quickly that there's bias in terms of whose papers get archived. And I was very aware writing the book about the sort of gendered and raced elements of the history of certainly military medicine in the US. But then the third kind of, I suppose, third and fourth kind of sources that I used were, especially as I got to the more modern cases, a lot of current medical journals, military medical journals. So I had to learn a lot of medicine as well as a lot of history for this book. And then I don't know if you would quite call it participant observation, but I attended several military medical conferences. And let me tell you, Lamis, they are much more fun than the conferences that you and I go to in general. I went to the Special Operations Medical Association conference, and also MHSRS, Military Health Systems Research Symposium, I think it's what it stands for. There are a lot of acronyms in military medicine and the military in general. And their exhibition floors are amazing. I will share, if it's okay, a couple of stories.
Please.
I remember, I believe this was at the Special Operations Medical Association meeting. They had this full body scan set up. And so you had all of these special operators who were stripping down to their skivvies and getting this full body scan. And I remember seeing that and thinking, oh, I'm really glad we don't do that at the political science conferences.
No.
But I also got to, there were these amazing there's just all this amazing equipment that you can try out and see. I mean, there are a lot of people who are they're trying to sell their latest product. So it's like a trade show almost in that sense. But I got to do pretend surgery using augmented reality goggles. Pretty sure the patient died because I'm not that kind of doctor. I tried on a prototype helmet that's supposed to protect against traumatic brain injury. There were a lot of mangled mannequins on the floor where people were advertising various devices and medications to deal with blood loss or hemorrhage. There was an ambulance that was heavily armored and had all this equipment inside that I could climb through and try out. So it was really fascinating to do that. I will say I was out with my family at Comic-Con in San Diego last summer, and they also have a very fun exhibition floor. And my daughter asked me, "Is this what your exhibition floors are like?" And I said, "No, our exhibition floors are much more tame. It's just books and papers and websites." But I really enjoyed being at those conferences and also just hearing the research that people in the military were doing and the kinds of questions that they were asking and talking to them about their experiences as well.
That sounds fascinating. So I want to make sure we get to sort of the incredibly sophisticated empirics that you have in the book. So your first empirical chapter is about the Civil War, the U.S. Civil War. Can you tell us what you find there?
Yes. So let me say first that I use the Civil War as kind of a baseline case for the rest of the book. There are obviously wars that the US is in before the Civil War, but this is the biggest war until then that the US is in. And one of the reasons that this is a baseline case is because it's a pre-germ theory of disease war. And so this is a war where disease is unequivocally the major killer in the war. Doctors really don't know what they're doing when it comes to disease. So, for example, they don't know to tell military commanders to build latrines a certain or sufficient distance away from camp. One of the books I was reading by an historian of medicine that had this anecdote that I just found really stuck with me was that soldiers found that their coffee tasted different when the horses were stabled upstream, but nobody knew why. And they also didn't know why they were getting dysentery and diarrhea. There is, apologies to listeners if this is a little bit gross, but I'm afraid there's a lot of gross when it comes to military medicine. So one of the sources that I used for the Civil War chapter is the 6-volume official medical history of the Civil War. And each of the volumes is on a different topic. And one of the volumes is on something called the Alvine fluxes. Have you ever heard that phrase before, Lemise?
I had not until I looked at your book.
Right. So the Alvine fluxes is basically dysentery and diarrhea. So I read, 1,000 pages on poop so that nobody else has to. So, sort of just basic sanitary practices were just not something that were used because people didn't know or understand the consequences of not using them. Doctors didn't understand, they observed, but they did not understand why patients recovered better when they were outside in the open air. But based on that observation, they started to design hospitals that had more ventilation. There were malaria epidemics, there were a lot of typhoid in the Civil War. There was even a quote unquote disease called, again, quote unquote, typhomalaria, because they couldn't quite distinguish the symptoms of the two. So they kind of invented this new hybrid disease, didn't really exist. But and sometimes another anecdote that I really found fascinating for the book was that sometimes they kind of stumbled into the correct procedure. So, for example, for the South in the Civil War, because of the embargoes, they didn't have silk for sutures, or they weren't able to access silk for sutures. And so what they started to do is use horsehair, but horsehair is pretty stiff. And so they boiled it to make it more pliable. And what happens when you boil something, you make it sterile. So the patients whose sutures were sewn using horsehair actually were more likely to survive, or at least less vulnerable to infection. So they kind of stumbled into this, but they didn't understand why. And there were lots of examples like that. They were more successful. So they were not very successful on the disease front. They were somewhat successful in terms of treating wounds. So there was a lot of advances made with respect to how to deal with amputations, for example. And I think that there's a stereotype about the Civil War that doctors were saw happy and they were just amputating left and right. And there is some truth to that, but there's also some reason to why they did it, and you kind of have to put yourself in the time. They did it because it actually was, in some ways, given the medicine at the time, the best procedure that they had, one of the best tools that they had available to them. But when it came to logistics, they were actually more successful. Prior to the Civil War, for example, hospitals were not really a thing in the US. If you were sick or if you were injured, then you were cared for at home and you were attended to by your mother, by your sister, by your wife. It's obviously for men, but in other words, women were the caregivers, and hospitals were really for the indigent. You just didn't want to go to a hospital if you had any kind of means. But of course, during the Civil War, they start to build hospitals because they need these military hospitals. And I think one of the really interesting parts of this story is precisely the role of women, because all of these women who in the past would have taken care of their husbands, fathers, sons, brothers at home, kind of shoulder their way onto the battlefield, saying, nope, we're here, we're going to provide this care. And so the Civil War is kind of the birth of nursing as a profession in the US, which opens a lot of doors for women in many different ways. But another really important logistical change in the Civil War, because I think it's important to realize that medicine has lots of different components. I'm just going to back up a little bit and say that we think of medicine as the kind of care that we receive from our doctor. Are we getting an antibiotic? Are we getting some sort of an injection? Are we undergoing an operation? But there's a lot of infrastructure around medicine, and that's especially important perhaps in the context of military medicine. And so hospitals are part of that infrastructure, staffing, nurses are part of that infrastructure, but also especially in the context of military medicine, evacuation is a key part of that infrastructure. And so a year or two into the war, Jonathan Letterman was hired to be the medical director of the Army of the Potomac, and he famously changed the evacuation procedures for the Union Army dramatically. He made sure that there was a real ambulance corps, that it was staffed. He changed the medical kit that doctors had, and all of a sudden you could evacuate people much more quickly. And one thing that doctors have always known for a long time is that the quicker you get somebody higher level medical care, the more likely they are going to be to survive. So that's kind of a little bit of a summary of the medical part of the Civil War. The veteran story is really fascinating because what happens after the Civil War is that you have a lot of veterans, right? I mean, a lot of people die, obviously, but there are also a lot of people who survive and are veterans, and they become this kind of political class. And the nature of veterans benefits after the Civil War is pensions. And pensions kind of start being set up in a way that the really only people who were injured in the war, and only from the Union Army, obviously, are eligible for these pensions. But then eventually, over time, politicians realize, and they're also lobbied by veterans groups, especially the Grand Army of the Republic, which is a predecessor to the groups like the American Legion today. So they end up expanding the veterans benefit system more and more and more, really loosening the eligibility such that by 1893, 40% of the US federal income is going to veterans benefits. And so we are really seeing the cost of war, the long-term cost of war in the case of the Civil War.
You have a fascinating anecdote in the book about the person who lived, I think, to 2020 and was the last person to to receive.
Yeah. So Mose Triplett was he was a real character, I think. He was a Confederate soldier, and then he becomes a Union soldier, and he survives the war. You can read the book to read the story. But one of the things that a lot of veterans, especially Union veterans, would do after the war is they would marry much younger women. And the deal was basically the younger woman would take care of him, and then she would get the widow's pension. And so Mose Triplett's daughter, by his, I don't remember if she was his first or second or third wife, doesn't die until 2020, and she is the last surviving recipient of a Civil War pension in the US. So, I mean, talk about the long tail of the cost of war.
Yeah, it really brings it home. So after that, you trace the evolution of military medicine and veterans benefits during the world wars, right? Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so World War One is a really interesting case, and it connects to World War Two partly because given how much of the US was spending on pensioners, on benefits for pensioners, this is actually part of the reason why the US is very hesitant to enter World War One. But at the same time, you have these doctors in the early 20th century really being very proud of their profession, because medicine is kind of recently professionalized at that point. We know about germ theory of disease, but these doctors are so confident, I mean, really overconfident, that they're making an argument that we're going to be able to do such a good job taking care of wounded soldiers that it's actually going to be safe to go to war. It's called the safe war movement. And it's, no more dangerous to go to war than it is to just live your civilian life, which is really a remarkable thing to say. I don't even think you need historical perspective to say that. I think that's remarkable in any moment to say that. But they do know, I mean, they have certainly advanced in terms of the medicine. They know, for example, about the germ theory of disease. We don't have penicillin yet. That doesn't happen until World War II, but there's much better control of infectious disease. But at the same time, of course, the war not just coincides with, but spreads the 1918 flu, which leads to this pandemic that ends up killing more US soldiers, right, than battle in World War One. So they're better, but then they have this terrible thing that happens, right? That ends up meaning that you still have more people dying from disease than from battle. They have some limited evacuation. They've forgotten some of the lessons of the Civil War, but they start to recover some of them. But it's really striking, I will say, reading some of the histories, especially the official medical history of World War One, which is of course written and published years after World War One, because they have all these plans and then the war ends, right? And then, so there's not much that happens medically in World War One, partly because the US is in it for such a short period of time. But there is a little bit more that happens on the veterans front, which is that because they want to avoid a new generation of pensioners, they adopt a new model. So instead of pensions, the idea is that we're going to rehabilitate people so that they're good as new. This is not fully effective for lots of reasons that you could imagine. And it actually leads to a lot of political agitation on the part of veterans, especially during the Depression. So there's this very famous event, the Bonus March, where they're asking or really demanding, and there's an encampment near Washington, D.C., where veterans are demanding they're demanding pensions. They want to be compensated for their service. They want to be compensated for the opportunity cost of having gone to war. They really feel like they've been treated unfairly. And so this is very much in the mind of policymakers as the US enters World War II as well. They're really worried about this, and it ends up informing how the US develops its veterans benefit system after World War II. But I'll return to that and maybe talk a little bit about the medical part of World War II first, and say that, again, the knowledge of disease has really improved. But one important difference between World War I and World War II is not just how long the US is in the war for, but also how many more theaters the US is fighting in. So the diseases that are endemic in East Asia are different, or in the Pacific in general are quite different than some of the diseases that are going to be endemic in France. Malaria is a big issue, including in some parts of Europe, like Italy. STDs are a huge issue in this war, but there are also major medical advancements in the war, partly because, again, the US is in the war for a longer period of time. One of them is penicillin gets developed during the war, and actually is in a lot of ways. So it ends up saving a lot of lives in terms of battle effectiveness, though, where it ends up mattering the most is precisely in treating STDs, because it used to be that if you were if you had syphilis or gonorrhea, you would be out for weeks or months. But with penicillin, you could just be out for like a day or two, if that. Another really crucial advance in World War II is the use of whole blood for transfusions instead of plasma, which just means that you can oxygenate the blood much more quickly. And people are much more likely to survive. And then there are other advances like the way in which you debride wounds, you clean wounds, secondary closure. In other words, if you are operating on somebody, if you're the first person to operate on somebody, you maybe don't fully close the wound right away. You kind of, you know that there's more to be done. And there are sort of advantages to that. There's a lot better evacuation. There's mechanized transport on ground. And there's the beginnings of air evacuation as well. There are also more medical issues because now you have an Air Force, right? It's not its own service during World War II, but it's called the Army Air Forces, but there are a lot of bureaucratic politics in there, and they know that they're going to want to be their own service. And, truthfully though, there are just different medical issues if you're flying in the air at, a certain altitude compared to if you're on the ground. And so they have to start addressing those issues as well. But so you have much better medicine, and what's called the case fatality rate, the percentage of people who are treated and survive improves in World War II compared to World War I. So you have a significant number of veterans returning home from the war. Of course, many fatalities in the war, both combatants and civilians, which is important to acknowledge, even though the civilian combatants are not the focus of this book. And again, politicians are realizing that they're going to have to figure out a way to manage this veteran population. And it's a big veteran population. And the size of the mobilization for World War II creates fears of another bonus march or something like it, because you're going to have all of these men who know how to use weapons returning home. But they want to avoid that outcome, but they also don't want to go back to the Civil War pension era. So they developed the GI Bill, which ends up focusing on other kinds of benefits like housing, education. They also stand up the VA health system. So the kinds of benefits that World War II veterans are receiving are really benefits that are meant to launch them into what ends up becoming this enormous middle class in the US. And, we all know the stories of the Greatest Generation, and that, a lot of that is underpinned by the GI Bill.
Okay, so now we move to kind of the contemporary era, right? And wars that are fought in a very different environment. So these are not conventional wars. These are counterinsurgencies in Afghanistan and Iraq. Can you tell us, what things look like in that context?
Yeah, they look really different. Disease is not nearly as much of a factor in these wars. It's not that it doesn't happen, it happens, but it's much better controlled. And in the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, military medical logistics matter a lot. And we see this on a number of fronts. So, for example, there is much better data collection, especially compared to the earlier wars. So it's, just to maybe connect a little bit to what I was saying about the Civil War, when you read the first volume of the official medical history of the Civil War, on, the first few pages, it's very clear that the authors are wrestling with disparate, inconsistent casualty numbers, and they just don't know. And they don't have a good data collection system. It's inconsistent. Everybody's using something different, if they even fill it out at all. Fast forward to, the 21st century, and there is a data collection system that gets stood up during these wars, during the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, that is meant to produce evidence-based medicine. And that is exactly what it does. So you have the data collection system, or one aspect of it is called the Department of Defense Trauma Registry. So anytime there's a casualty, it's supposed to be logged and sent back to the Department of Defense. But as a result of this data, you have these new systems that are created. One of them is called a Tactical Combat Casualty Care, or TCCC system, which is a set of guidelines about, how do we deal with trauma, especially in a pre-hospital setting in the field. And one of the things that happens, and I'll just say that one of the really interesting things about writing this book is seeing how many times lessons are learned and then lost. And an example of that is the focus on hemorrhage or blood loss. So there's a very famous paper that's published in 1984 by a military doctor, Ron Bellamy, where he finds that 38% of Korean and Vietnam War fatalities could have been saved had hemorrhage been managed. And this leads to really a revolution in hemostatics, or the study of basically dealing with blood loss. So tourniquets, for example, had fallen out of use for a very long time. Doctors really didn't like them. And then they realized, oh, if we have tourniquets, then we can do a much better job managing blood loss. So let's bring tourniquets back. And not only do they bring tourniquets back, they invent a new kind of tourniquet. It's called a combat application tourniquet, sometimes called the ratchet tourniquet or the one-handed tourniquet. And the advantage of this tourniquet is that you can apply it yourself. So you would actually have soldiers or military personnel walking around bases in Iraq and Afghanistan with these tourniquets loosely applied, so that if they were injured, they could just tighten and apply it themselves. And that way, their buddy doesn't have to stop what they're doing to apply the tourniquet. And they can actually engage in the battle. Clotting agents are developed, things like quick clot. And whole blood returns. It has fallen out of use after, at some point between kind of Korea and the Afghanistan war. It's a mystery that I tried to solve in this book, but I actually could never quite figure out 100% to my satisfaction why it fell out of use. But I can tell you the story of how it comes back, which is there's this one military doctor, John Holcomb, who's a captain in the 90s and is in the Battle of Mogadishu in Somalia, and is told by his commander, his medical commander in the field, that, okay, we're going to do a walking blood bank. And that is something that he thought, this is just not something you do. He thought he was going to get arrested, actually, for doing that. He's on record saying that. But they do it, and he realizes very quickly is the same reaction exactly that the doctors in World War II do when they see the shift from using plasma to using whole blood, which is, wow, this is amazing. It works so well. And so the shift to whole blood, especially in a pre-hospital setting, is something that makes an enormous difference in the counterinsurgency wars. And then another factor that makes a big difference goes back to Jonathan Letterman's ideas about evacuation, because they realize or re-realize that the importance of getting people to higher level medical care in a timely fashion. And so in 2009, the military adopts what's called a golden hour policy. The idea is that if someone is injured, then they have to be evacuated to a higher medical facility within an hour, because that will dramatically increase their odds of survival. Today, people even talk about shorter periods of time, like the platinum 15 minutes. So just different precious metals, basically. But the reason that they're able to apply this rule is because the US has air superiority in Iraq and Afghanistan. So this is not to say that US aircraft were invulnerable. They definitely were shot down here and there. But it's quite different, for example, to what we see in Russia and Ukraine today, where there is not air superiority in that war. And at the same time, on the veterans benefits side of things, we just see this kind of continued trend of veterans benefits increasing over time. And part of that also has to do with the shift to the all-volunteer force in the US in 1973. So, before then we had a draft or conscription. And so once people have to volunteer for the military, you have to incentivize them to to be part of the military, to join the military. And so that leads also to an increase in veterans benefits. And so as I mentioned at the beginning, the wounded to killed ratio for the US and Iraq and Afghanistan just shoots way up. And it is really remarkable how effective military medicine is. In wars that were, in my personal and professional view, failures in a lot of ways. I think military medicine is one of the few victories. But again, there is this theme of one of the reasons that military medicine is so successful in these wars is because they are so long. And so there is an opportunity for the medicine to improve.
So far we've been focusing on kind of physical or physiological disease or injury, but you have a chapter focusing on psychological trauma. How does that fit into your analysis?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. Because I think it's a hugely important part of war. And I went back and forth on whether I wanted that to be its own chapter, or whether I should include it in the chapters for each war. But then I realized that it's really a unique set of illnesses. And so I have this kind of mouthful of a phrase, war-induced psychological trauma, that I use, at least for myself, to describe what I'm covering in that chapter. And part of the reason that I have this long descriptive phrase is because while it is the case that war trauma is as old as war, people will go back to Homer and find examples in the Odyssey and the Iliad of psychological trauma and war. I think it's really hard. It's not like malaria and it's not like a broken bone. It's really hard to say in 2024 that somebody in 1864 had PTSD. You just can't diagnose from that kind of historical distance. And I also think that's possible, and certainly people argue that the kinds of psychological trauma people experience vary over time due to changes in society and due to different wars. And for sure, what we call it has varied over time. So, for example, in the Civil War, psychological trauma was called, you can sort of pick your label, sometimes sunstroke, sometimes nostalgia, sometimes soldier's heart. In World War I, of course, it's called shell shock. Now, there were so many soldiers who suffered from shell shock in World War I that this is actually a real concern at the start of World War II. So the US implements this screening system to screen out people who they think are going to be susceptible to shell shock. It is completely ineffective, like utterly ineffective. But they remain concerned about this. And so they kind of strategically rename it. They don't want to call it shell shock anymore, so they call it battle fatigue or combat exhaustion, because then you can just go take a nap and be all better. And in fact, what they do, I mean, I'm being a little bit sarcastic here, but in fact, what they do is they sedate people for a day or two, and they just get them up to use the bathroom or something like that. But they want to avoid the stigma of shell shock, and they also want to get people back to the front as soon as possible. And then, of course, after Vietnam, we have PTSD, right? So PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, doesn't actually enter the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, until 1980. So we think of like PTSD as just a regular term, a regular word. It's entered the vernacular today, but this nomenclature has not been around for very long when you think about it. And there are sort of interesting politics to how it even gets into the DSM, where Vietnam veterans and psychologists who are helping them observe that gay activists in the US are able to successfully lobby the American Psychiatric Association to remove homosexuality as a disorder from the DSM. And so they realize, oh, you can actually pressure these people. And they apply pressure, and PTSD becomes part of the DSM and a more legitimate disease, at least in terms of medicine. But of course, in terms of society, these kinds of diseases have always been problematic. It has been very hard for veterans suffering these kinds of illnesses to receive benefits for these illnesses on using the justification that they have one of these illnesses over time. And we see that continuing today. I mean, so there are all sorts of new diagnoses, there's one called moral injury, which we hear about today, which is being treated with the same kind of skepticism that some of these earlier illnesses were treated with in the past. So I don't know what will happen with moral injury, but I think that the politics around this very important and really debilitating kind of psychological injury are not only fascinating, but very telling in terms of the kinds of injuries that people can suffer in war and the way that they're treated by society afterward.
Absolutely. So I'll mention to listeners that the book also includes a really insightful discussion of contexts of potential future wars that the U.S. might wage with Russia or China, and how these hidden costs of war might differ based on the possibility of air dominance, the kinds of weapons that might be used, the particular settings, and so on. But I'm not going to ask you about that, listeners. I encourage you to pick up the book to read up on that. What I want to ask you about, Nisha, are the policy recommendations that come out of this analysis.
Yeah, so I think the policy recommendations in a way are pretty straightforward. One of the really striking things to me in reading and doing the research for the book was that I realized how bad the US is at costing out wars ahead of time, full stop. So I think one recommendation is that we have to do a better job at thinking about how much wars are going to cost at a high level. Second, and more germane to the topic of the book, when we cost out wars ahead of time, we have to think about these longer term costs, because the reality is that today the bulk of the costs that the US is paying right now for Iraq and Afghanistan for those wars are the costs associated with advances in military medicine. So these veterans benefits, veterans healthcare, et cetera. That's what we're paying for. That's the long tail, and we're experiencing it now. And so we should know that medicine always gets better during war. We should expect that there's going to be improvement, even if there are military issues that you think are not going to lead to improvement. I would say that probably there are going to be improvements in medicine. And so I think that's a really important policy implication to just, when you think about the human cost of war and also the financial cost of war, anticipate that more people are going to survive than you think, basically, and that these people are going to need pretty extensive medical care. And then finally, we should, as a society, I think, or as a country, be investing much more in medicine, because I think that there's a way in which someone could hear the argument initially and think, oh, well, this is making war more costly. Let's roll back the medicine. Let's roll back the veterans benefits. It's not at all what I'm saying. I actually think we should double down on the medicine, partly because there are so many externalities that emerge. So, the tourniquets that were developed in the Iraq and Afghanistan wars were used to treat people during the Boston Marathon bombing. Whole blood is used in lots of places in the US and around the world now in a pre-hospital setting for civilians, and has saved many lives. And so I think that we should be investing much more in medicine than we are.
Thank you for that. So the book, I was reading through it, and the argument and the empirics, they're so tight. I think I described them to you as surgical, pun intended, right? So I wanted to ask, were there any challenges that you faced when you were researching or writing this book?
Yes. Well, thank you, first of all, for saying that. It's hard. It's hard to wrestle your words into something that really flows and makes a clear argument. So it's nice to know that it landed with at least one person. But I would say that there were definitely intellectual challenges, in the sense that I'm neither an historian nor a medical doctor, and this is a very interdisciplinary book, and so I wanted to be very careful in how I treated the work that historians have done, and I had to learn a lot on both the historical front in terms of historiography, but also I had to learn a lot of medicine, right? It was interesting though, because in my previous work, this book is qualitative, but in my previous work, I've done a lot of quantitative analysis. And so I was pretty well prepared to look at some of the quantitative work that medical doctors were doing, and honestly a little bit disappointed by some of it. It made me a little bit worried at times. But there were also logistical challenges, partly due to the pandemic. A lot of the book was written during the pandemic, and also, I remember getting I had at the start, before the pandemic started, I had in my house, I'd taken out from the University of Minnesota Library the 6-volume official medical history of the Civil War. And so I'm stuck at home. Okay, I guess we're going to start reading this book. And the pages were literally crumbling in my hand. And
wow.
I lost sleep. I had all this anxiety, and I decided I'm just going to have to find digitized versions of these, because I could not ethically work with materials that were like that. And I'm sort of amazed that they let me take them out from the library, given how fragile they were to begin with. I think they just didn't realize. And so I packed them up really carefully and gave them back to them as soon as I could. But I think those were some of the main challenges. And then also, I think another challenge is that this book, unlike my previous books, is not really a question-driven book. It's really an argument-driven book, and for me, that was an unusual place to be. And it has required some explanation when talking to colleagues who, are used to doing a different kind of research, or, even if insofar as they are familiar with my work, which I assume most people are not, that they might have been expecting something different from me. And then finally, because I want this book to have a broader readership, it's not just an academic book, making sure that it was more readable, especially given how many different disciplines are kind of pulled into it.
I can definitely attest that this is a very, very readable book. So Nisha, we've taken up a lot of your time. So I want to quickly ask you one final question. Briefly, this book just came out. Congratulations.
Yes.
What are you working on now?
So just for context, but I'll try and be brief, a lot of my work is driven by an interest in understanding change over time in international relations. And so I'm actually, well, I still have some work that I'm doing in the military and medicine space and in the international humanitarian law space and the sovereignty space. I'm actually pivoting to climate change right now. So, I have a series of projects on that topic, because not just because I'm interested in change, that's kind of the intellectual impetus, but also because I think it is the existential crisis of our time, is clearly a global issue, and international relations scholars, including me, have been really late to the party in trying to address and think about climate change. And so that's where I'm at right now.
That's fantastic. If you wind up writing a book, I hope that you'll come back and talk to us about that.
I'm sure I will.
Nisha, I really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you for being on the show today.
Thank you.
The book is Tanisha Fazal's Military Medicine and the Hidden Costs of War, published by Oxford University Press in 2024. Thank you for listening.